This week we're looking at the role of inflation. That's when prices go up. And we're looking at the role of inflation on our economy. So if you remember in a previous level we talked about Zimbabwe. We were looking at the goals that countries have. And one goal is to have stable prices. And Zimbabwe didn't have stable prices. In fact, they ended up producing $100 trillion bills. So inflation can be a problem. So this level we're going to look at what are the causes of inflation, what is the impact of it, so what are the costs, and we'll look at how we can take out inflation when we're measuring economic growth. Now, to discuss a little bit about inflation, let's talk about the housing bubble. So remember hearing about the housing bubble in, I guess, about 2007, 2008. We're starting to see housing prices in the U.S. go up dramatically. And lately, in 2017, we're seeing the same kind of thing that the U.S. was seeing. We're seeing it now with housing prices getting really big in Vancouver, in Toronto. So the housing prices get bigger and bigger. And that's because there's lots of demand. That could be demand from foreigners, which is what we're seeing now in Canada, in the Vancouver and Toronto market. Foreigners are investing in Canada by buying real estate. In 2007, 2008, the housing bubble in the U.S. was created because the U.S., in order to encourage economic growth, reduced some of the laws on what was required in order to buy a house. So more people had the ability to buy a house, and so that then led to increased demand and drove up prices. Well, when we talk about a housing bubble, we're talking about a change in prices. So you can think about it like you think about this balloon here. When the balloon's bigger, the balloon is inflating. And the same thing happens to prices. Prices inflate. They get bigger. So one day you pay a certain amount for a good and the next day you pay more for it. Inflation. Deflation, well, the balloon deflated. So it decreased in size. Deflation is when prices decrease. Okay, so with the housing bubble, what we saw is increased demand, and that increase in demand meant that we had inflation. Prices kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, it's called a housing bubble because as prices get bigger and bigger, they're really hard to sustain. It's hard to keep up those high prices. Eventually, people just can't afford to pay for those expensive houses. And that creates a bubble burst. And a bubble bursts when that market can no longer sustain those high prices, and so we see a drastic decrease in prices. We see a deflation, and it was that housing bubble burst that impacted the 2008 recession that the U.S. saw, and that brought down Canada's economy as well. So right now in 2017, we're seeing a housing bubble in Canada, and you can see there are methods that are being put into place in the last couple months to avoid that housing bubble from bursting and impacting the rest of the economy. So increased requirements as to who can buy a house, what you have to have for a down payment, what kind of credit you must have, and even with interest rates. So the idea is that you may qualify at the current interest rate, but they're actually checking whether or not you can afford at a higher interest rate to make sure that we don't experience that housing bubble burst. So check out this level and check out how inflation impacts the economy and how we can take out inflation when measuring economic growth.